Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Louise Richardson. I'm the Vice-Chancellor, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this session to celebrate the centenary of PPE. I should just remind you that this session is being recorded so that it will be available for other alumni who'd like to watch it afterwards. So the term PPE has become a part of our everyday lives over the past 6 months, but for the past 100 years, PPE and was synonymous with Oxford, had a very different meaning, as we know, politics, philosophy, and economics. And the Humanities and Social Sciences Division, to mark the centenary, have produced a report which will be available to all of you after this session, providing a history of the course and people who have taken it. In what is perhaps the best form of flattery, imitation, this course has been replicated in 172 institutions in 33 countries. It was introduced, as you read in the report, as a modern take on a classical education, the modern answer to the Greeks and the greats. And it was introduced in the same year that women were matriculated at Oxford for the very first time. So the report gives you a very different view than one hears in the press. But just remember how the press see PPE. They see it as a degree very popular amongst politicians. And in thinking about just some of the names of the people who have studied this degree, it really is quite extraordinary. The current Chancellor of the Exchequer and his predecessor and the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, for example, all studied PPE. Matt Hancock, from whom we hear every day, and his predecessor, Jeremy Hunt, studied PPE. But so too did Atul Gawande, who has a very different perspective on health. So it's clear that there isn't just one perspective imparted by students who study PPE. We have had three prime ministers, Cameron, Heath, and Wilson, and 3 Labour Party leaders, Miliband, Foote, and Gateskill, so both of the left and of the right. But also even further left and further right, Dr. Rose Dugdale, former IRA activist and prisoner, and Rupert Murdoch also studied PPE. Overseas, we have a member of the US Supreme Court, Stephen Barr. We have the General Wesley Clark, commander of NATO, no less than 3 prime ministers of Australia, 4 prime ministers of Pakistan, plus a president, and the list goes on and on. And of course, we have today's distinguished panelists. And I'd like at this point to hand you over to Evan Davis, who is going to chair this afternoon's panel. His will be a familiar face and a familiar voice to those of you who watch BBC and who listen to Radio 4. He presents PM and The Bottom Line, and indeed Dragon's Den. He has also presented Newsnight as well as the Today programme. But before joining the BBC, Evan was an economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies at the London Business School. And before that, he studied PPE at St. John's and went on to earn an MPP at the Kennedy School of Government. He's written and co-written several books, including the recent one, Post-Truth, Why We Have Reached Peak Expletive Deleted and What We Can Do About It. So with that, let me hand over to Evan to introduce our panelists to you. Over to you, Evan.
Louise, thank you so much. And it's a great privilege to be here and in the company of the giants who have studied PPE in the past. What an interesting time it is with COVID, with the American election this year. And of course, the whole theme of the relationship between, if you like, the PPE class as in the Oxford University PPE types and the real world PPE types who wear PPE to protect themselves every day at work. And the relationship between these worlds, absolutely fascinating discussion at this point. A lot of people blame PPEists for the problems of the world, but let's face it, 100 years ago, the world had been through a lot. There were problems before PPEists came along. Now, our plan is to have a discussion for about an hour with democracy and its fate very much on our minds. You, the audience, can ask questions. If you look at the little panel below, you will see a Q&A box and you can put questions into there. And if it all works properly, I will see them here and we'll pick some to put to our panel. But we actually have a pretty awesome panel to discuss where we are and how we can improve things, and how Oxford University in particular can improve things. Ann Sieghart, journalist and broadcaster at the Times for nearly 20 years, frequently appears on Radio 4, and spent 2018-19 as a visiting fellow at All Souls, working on a book about women and authority, how and why we still take women less seriously than men. And Ann studied PPE at Wadham, starting in 1979. Monica Ali is, as you know, the best-selling writer of Brick Lane, Booker shortlisted novel, translated into many languages and a major film as well, and a very good one. Of Bangladeshi heritage, the book focuses on a Bangladeshi woman marrying an older man in Tower Hamlets here. Monica's written many other books, Untold Story, for example, about a princess who fakes her death to lead a normal life. And Monica has also been involved with Radio 4. She was a guest editor on the Today programme, which I used to work on, and has presented several editions of Point of View, and has taught creative writing at Columbia University in New York. And she was a distinguished writer in residence at the University of Surrey and matriculated in PPE at Wadham in 1986. And also joining us, Mayor Pete. I'm saying Mayor Pete, because then it's Mary, Monica, Mayor Pete. It's all beginning with M. Pete Buttigieg served as two-term mayor of South Bend, Indiana, but is more notable as a candidate in the presidential primaries this year, and made an extraordinary impact in double quick time. And Pete's background is that he studied at Harvard and then did a 2-year compressed PPE period as a Rhodes Scholar at Pembroke. More recently than the rest of us, that was in 2005. And Pete had also served in the US Navy Reserve and was deployed to Afghanistan. Before we get into the discussion, I'd just like to hear no more than a minute each on how you look back on your own PPE experiences. Ann, maybe you could start us off. You know, was it useful? Did you drop one? Did you drop the right one? What's your experience?
I dropped, oddly enough, even though I wanted to be a political journalist, I actually dropped politics. And you might think that was quite quixotic. It was because my father said to me, look, if you don't learn philosophy and economics at university, you'll never learn them in later life. Politics, you can just read in the bath. So I read politics in the bath and did philosophy and economics, which was an unusual combo, but you know, quite a good one, I suppose. I think with hindsight, I regret it because I was most interested in politics, and philosophy was a little bit up its own fundament, I would say. But what PPE actually taught me brilliantly was how to blag. And as a journalist, you really do have to blag. You've got to pick up facts very, very quickly, get on top of them very quickly, often starting from scratch at the beginning of the day and writing something at least apparently erudite by the end of it. I guess a PPE degree helped me do that.
Yeah, I dropped politics as well. And I was also more interested in politics than philosophy, but I thought, I'm going to challenge myself to do the one I'm not interested in. And I think you're right about it. It's very good at helping you muster your thoughts quickly and organize your thoughts in a structured way. Pete, what about you? How was your PPE?
So my path to it was a little bit different because I had a US BA under my belt, and I thought, okay, second BA, how hard can this be? My main recollections are of being humbled repeatedly and terrorized by the program. I remember getting a phone call from the economics tutor in the spring before I came up saying, we just wanted to make sure you're not planning on doing all three, including economics, are you? And I said, no, that's the whole point. That's why I wanted to do this as part of my scholarship. And we negotiated an arrangement where if I could master the first years, because the scholarship only covered 2 years, if I could just do year one of economics during Michaelmas term, then they'd turn me into a second year and we'd be good to go. I thought, great, no problem. And then arrived and was profoundly humbled by the discovery that the tutorial, which at Harvard meant a kind of freewheeling, pleasant, laid-back discussion with a faculty member about some topic, in this context meant a weekly oral exam, to the point that I was actually ejected from my first tutorial for not being prepared. And the indignity for a Rhodes Scholar who thinks of himself as one of the top students in his country to be thrown out of a class when he's the only participant, signifying that the tutor thinks it's a better use of her time just not to be dealing with you at all than attempting to teach you, was actually the exact humiliation that was needed in order for me to understand the rigors of the system. And thankfully it all had a happy ending, though it felt pretty touch and go during my first weeks in Oxford.
I think it was Linda Yu.
Preparation. Yeah.
It was Linda Yu who was the economics tutor who chucked you out, who has gone on to a great career.
Yes, in fact, I would have nightmares about being unprepared for economics and then wake up bleary-eyed to Dr. Yu's voice on Radio 4, waking me up as she was commenting on some public matter of economics. So, but again, through that pressure cooker, it was exactly what I needed, frankly. A wonderful, but perhaps not quite as precise education with a history and literature degree at Harvard to have an environment where you need to know exactly what it is you mean, exactly what the question was. And that's a wonderful preparation for politics where, as in tutorial, anything you do that's even the slightest bit off will have a lot of holes poked in it very quickly.
Monica, what about you?
Well, people usually assume that I studied English literature because I'm a novelist, but I'm really glad that I didn't study English, because I think it would have ruined the novel for me, particularly at the college that I was at, which was Wadham. So I definitely wanted to go to Wadham because it was seen as the most progressive of all the colleges. And I was a little bit surprised when I got there to find that I was the only girl out of 10 PPEists at Wadham. And during the 3 years of the course, I didn't have a single female tutor. So I hope that that's changed now, that you wouldn't find that situation anymore. But I'm really grateful that I did PPE. I think that it shaped me as the kind of writer that I aspire to be. I think it's helped me to think clearly and logically, at least I hope so. I was clearing out some stuff in my attic a couple of years ago, and I came across the first year logic paper, and that was compulsory. I don't know whether it still is, but I think it still should be. And I couldn't read the questions because I've forgotten all the notation. And I thought, gosh, I must have been a lot cleverer back then, because I have no idea how to do this paper now. But it dawned on me a little bit later that although I've forgotten the notation, it's like a foreign language, I don't think I've forgotten the skills of clear thinking and logic that was not only part of that paper, but also, as Pete was saying, part of the entire tutorial process.
All right, well, we're not here to reminisce, much as though we want to. In 1919, the Lady Margaret Hall Chronicle commented that this newly planned degree, PPE, was indicative of a moment of change in the world and in Oxford. Quote, "Since influenza and armistice, the sense of surprise at the new Oxford is persistent. A sense of life and development seems to mark the university's doings." Now, the first cohort of students to take the final honours in 1923, because of course they started in 20, were asked to address a number of topical questions. Many of them focused on the role of democracy within a global system. For example, what is democracy? To what extent and with what results was international administration attempted before 1914? How far is the League of Nations engaged with that? Illustrate the inherent dangers of democracy as analysed by Bryce from his account of the US and of Australia. And what we thought, given the kind of stuff that was being written about PPE as it started, is we'd give you each just a moment or two to give us your reflections on these questions at this historical moment, at our own time. So your reflections really on where we are, and that's a fairly broad question. And then later, we want to ask you how to encourage Oxford to confront these questions in surprising and new ways. What is the Oxford challenge, apart from coming up with a vaccine for COVID? So I think let's start on the kind of, get each of you just to talk about where we are, and not too long, each of you, couple minutes, 2 or 3 minutes. Mary Ann, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, I was born only 16 years after the end of the Second World War, and my father was a refugee from the Nazis, so it was just carved into our hearts from childhood that democracy, human rights, civil liberties were our only protection from something like that ever happening again. So to us, democracy was an unquestioned good. I mean, in fact, an absolute necessity. Which is why it's so alarming to me that today's young people have nothing like this attachment to democracy. They don't have parents who lived through the war. And a recent poll in the UK found that 66% of 25 to 34-year-olds favour strong leaders who don't have to bother with Parliament. 66%. 36% support rule by the army, and 26% believe democracy is a bad way to run the country. I mean, how scary is that? And this is not just a British phenomenon either, because in America, only 19% of millennials agree that it's illegitimate for the military to take over if the government's incompetent or failing to do its job. And almost half of US millennials say they want a strong leader. So in Australia, Britain, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Sweden, and America, all of them quintessentially free democracies, the percentage of people who say it's essential to live in a democracy has plummeted, and it's especially low among the young. And I think this is really worrying. And at the same time, popular authoritarian governments like China and Rwanda actually have far higher levels of trust and approval from their citizens than democratic ones like ours. And you might think, oh, well, that's just a cultural phenomenon. You know, maybe Chinese people are more deferential to their rulers. But actually, the authoritarian Chinese government is twice as trusted as the democratic Taiwanese one, even though its citizens have the same culture. And Rwanda, meanwhile, rates higher even than China, and certainly higher than the US or the UK. So why might this be? Well, democratic pluralism and free market capitalism have done great to tip power and wealth to my generation and older, and not so well to help the aspiring young. So perhaps it's not surprising that across the world, millennials are much more positive than older generations about Xi Jinping and the new China. They see him setting clear national priorities and investing hugely in the future. Don't seem that bothered by his habit of crushing dissent or rounding up and sterilizing Uyghurs. So going back to the 1923 questions, I'm much more bothered by the dangers of authoritarianism than I am by the dangers of democracy. But the danger of democracy not delivering for younger generations is that we slide through populism into a more autocratic form of government. Now, A.D. Lindsay, who was the great master of Balliol, who helped to establish PPE as a degree course, he wrote in his book, The Modern Democratic State, about the fragility of democracy and the ease with which the state could quickly undermine democratic institutions and move towards totalitarian control. Now, we're starting to see that already in countries like Hungary and Poland and Turkey. And if Trump's re-elected, we'll probably see more of it in the US. And we're even getting hints of it here in the UK, with a government showing little respect for the rule of international law and sometimes even for a pluralistic free press. Now, I've got some hope that the COVID pandemic is bringing people back to their senses, because which countries have been hit worse by the coronavirus? Well, it's the US, it's Brazil, it's India and the UK, all of which have populist leaders. And which countries have done best? Well, it's those like Germany and New Zealand, which have sensible, moderate, female, I might say, prime ministers who avoid bluster and exceptionalism, and instead were very quick to follow precautionary policies based on expert evidence. And we're also seeing evidence in the polls, particularly in countries like Germany, that support for populist parties and principles have fallen quite a lot recently. We've seen a bit of a decline in Trump's poll ratings since COVID, and populist parties in other countries like Sweden and Finland have also dropped in the polls. So you might think expose populism to a real crisis and its support melts away. But we really can't afford to get complacent. So yes, populist governments mess up, but so do moderate democratic ones. And if the pandemic leads us into a severe global recession, if the vaccines don't work, if we're trapped for years on this endless lockdown, reopen treadmill, voters may just lose their patience and surrender to populist promises again. So I think what moderate democracies have to do actually is to have a look at these more popular authoritarian regimes and see what it is that they're doing well. I mean, there are obviously lots of things that we don't want to copy, but there are ways in which they have managed to engage trust in their citizenry that liberal democracies haven't. I'll hand back on that.
All right, and interesting, Marianne. So I just want to push on one thing. Do you believe the polls when people say they prefer strong government or the military taking over if the government's screwing up than democracy? Because I've seen them and I worry about them. On the other hand, I just wonder whether people just play with us a little by giving an answer that they know is a sort of indication that they just want things to be a bit stronger and a bit more decisive than democracy sometimes offers. But of course, they would miss it if it was actually not democracy, or if it was the military or whatever.
Well, I mean, I very much hope you're right, Alan. What I actually think is they haven't thought it through.
Right.
And what they haven't realised is that the corollary of a strong leader is that often you can't get rid of a strong leader. And I really don't think they've thought it through. And the trouble is that people like Trump are telling them that the current system is rigged. And so they're hearing all this bad stuff about the current system. And what they're not hearing enough of is cautionary tales about what they might get instead. Yeah. And as I say, you slip slide. It happens slowly, but a bit like a ratchet. It's terribly hard to regain your freedoms once you've lost them. And I just don't think we're being vigilant enough.
All right. On that note, Monica, why don't you give us your take where we are?
At some stage, I hope we're going to talk about what democracy actually is. I mean, what do we mean by democracy? Maybe we should do that in part of the general conversation, but I think therein lies the problem for a lot of the things that are contributing to this waning of the popularity of democracy. I think some of those problems come from within, from the weakness of the model as it's currently set up. Having said that, I just want to build a bit on what Marianne's been talking about in terms of the decline of democracy around the world. I mean, first of all, I want to say I don't think we should be so surprised as we are. I mean, Athens was the first democratic system of government, and there was a sort of interlude of 2,000 years before it was brought back. So I don't think that we should have been deluded into thinking that history had ended in the second half of the 20th century. I know that was a popular view at the time, but it never seemed at all feasible to me. In terms of why right now democracy seems to be struggling, many reasons. I think one is that the link between economic growth and liberal democracy was broken when China had both stability and rapid economic progress, whilst in the West we were undergoing the meltdown of the financial crisis and all the chaos that ensued from that. I think that there are fake democracies now. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the right term, but that's how I think of them. So the Putins, what's happening in Turkey. So you can vote, but there's, you might be poisoned if you're an opposition leader. There's no free press and so on. South Africa, the corruption of the government. We were so hopeful when the ANC took power, and that has I suppose tarnished democracy in its own way. Bangladesh, where the opposition routinely boycotts elections now. So there's the fake democracy. I think there's also the failures of the new democracies that were so inspiring to so many people at the times when those popular revolutions were sweeping across the Middle East or in Ukraine, and it turned out that it was a lot easier to depose, dethrone authoritarian leaders than it was to institute democracy. So that's also had an impact. And then the failures of the old democracies. I mean, even before Trump started urging people to vote twice, etc. There was a democratic deficit within the US. I mean, you know, just for one instance, one example would be the impression of money being a key factor in the democratic process, such that democracy is almost for sale. Obama being unable to get a budget through seems less like a terrific system of checks and balances on government and more like a disaster. The EU has its own problems with the democratic process. So it's technocracy is how some people see it. It's an elite gravy train as other people see it. When people started voting on the Lisbon Treaty in ways that the EU didn't like, they just stopped the voting. So there are lots of problems. And then from above, of course, there are sort of problems from above and problems from below, because democracy works at the level of the nation state. That's how it's worked historically, and now problems have become global in nature, from tax to climate. It's no longer feasible to solve those problems without having supranational powers, but that is seen as ceding the power of the population to control their own destiny. So there's a conflict there. And from below you get secessionist movements from Catalonia or Scotland, or even US city mayors. They're wanting to bring power back from national governments to themselves. There's also the lobbyists and special interest groups, so Black Lives Matters and Extinction Rebellion. So there are all of these terrific pressures on the traditional model of liberal democracy. And I think the biggest one is that the understanding of what democracy means has been eroded to such an extent that it no longer makes sense to a lot of people in a lot of contexts. And I think that's why we should talk about what democracy actually is at some point in this discussion.
You're on mute, Evan.
Muted, Evan.
I popped that down. We're going to have to race through everything. But look, let's go straight to Pete, get his take on this, and then we will come back because there's a lot to unpack in what we've heard already. But Pete, why don't you give us your take?
There is, and I'll be brief because I think Monica's identified such an important question that's also, of course, classically in the tradition of PPE, which is to examine what it is we actually mean by democracy. And I also really think that Marianne's identification of trust as one of the best lenses to look at this through is really important. Of course, I come at this from a US perspective, and my country is defined by democracy as the cornerstone of our identity. I would argue that our system, because we're not an ethno-linguistic nation, we're a nation built around a civic identity, that our understanding of democracy is as elemental to what it is to be an American as perhaps the Union Jack or the monarchy are to what it is to be British, or the Japanese language to what it is to be Japanese. And yet, the United States, of course, has never fully been a democracy, both in terms of the patterns of exclusion that have been present from the very beginning in terms of who had access to the vote and who had access to power, but also in terms of backsliding, even within the realm of democracy as we've defined it. And so now we find that a country that views ourselves as the most consequential democracy since that of the Athenians not only must confront the many ways in which we've been less than fully democratic, but also the ways in which we are becoming less democratic than perhaps we were not long ago. This is in particular I think, trick bag for reformers right now, certainly for my party politically in the US right now. Because on one hand, on the front end, we are working very vigorously to prevent some of the patterns of voter suppression that may be more subtle and attenuated than they were in, say, the 1950s, but are no less real in terms of their capacity to diminish the ability of some Americans to vote. For example, the fact that polling places have become less and less available, especially in neighborhoods that are majority Black, or the many ways in which our own president is resisting the opportunity to vote by mail, even though that's how he votes. But we need to make sure at the very same time that there is activism to support the universality and the integrity of our democracy ahead of the November elections, that we're also on the lookout for the project that certainly President Trump is leading, of delegitimizing our elections or delegitimizing any election that they lose. This is also going to be a tremendous problem. Part of what I'm trying to do right now is to prepare the US public for the fact that we will likely not have results on election day, something that was also frustratingly the case for different reasons during one of my own major election days in Iowa. But in this case would not represent anything nefarious. It would actually be an indication that election officials are doing their job. Ours has always been a messy system. Elections in the US are run under the authority of individual states and largely implemented by volunteers working for county clerks. And yet this system has generally added up to one that is trusted. As that trust is eroded, we are less and less able to really claim to be a democracy. You add to that the counter-majoritarian instruments that are already in the structure of our Constitution, the fact that by the makeup of the US Senate, a majority of Americans are represented by a minority of senators. You add to that the fact that the Electoral College means that twice in my own lifetime, the American people have been overruled by this arcane mechanism. And the choice for president of the majority of the people did not, in fact, get to serve or win the election. And you can see just how much we've been brought to the brink. And I suspect this is behind the skepticism among youth, at least in the US, that while there were some alarming poll numbers cited, I actually view the youngest generation as the least illiberal, certainly the most committed to the rights of minorities and the most interested in a government that's authentically serving the people. But perversely, we found that proto-authoritarian leaders like our current president are able to profit politically by the overall policy failure that we've witnessed, I would argue, over the last 40 or so years, as our country has grown more and more unequal and our government has grown less and less responsive, at least at the federal level, to the needs of the citizens. And so often, many of those who, in my view, have a political program that is contributing to the problem, have also been able to benefit from the overall cynicism, sometimes leading even to a decision not to vote at all, accounting for our comparatively low voter turnout rates in the US, and putting the entire democratic project, such as it is in the US, in danger. All that we have seen has brought us to a point where I think it's not unlike the teens and the 20s and the early days of PPE, where these elemental questions are not an academic concern, they're a very live one. And having grown up at a time when it was simply assumed that democracy was preferred and that it was better and that it was enduring in any place that I was in, we now find ourselves in a moment when I think it's very much on the ball.
Thank you for that, Pete. I mean, you're all quite down, really, aren't you? And obviously the world is in a very difficult place. I mean, I think some of the time people say it's not working because we need more democracy, and some of the time they're saying it's not working because it's too paralyzed or it's the wrong kind of politicians. And I want to just pick up and ask you each very briefly whether the problem over the last few decades hasn't been this gulf between the two worlds of PPE, the politicians who study PPE and the people who wear PPE at work. And I noticed you've got a question actually from Dwayne Cronky, who says, Tom Friedman recently said that in the US, the big issue is people without college education feeling humiliated and as a result having great resentment, which fuels the big divides in US culture and politics. And Dwayne is, you know, actually onto something, isn't he? A lot of people just don't like the political class. And when someone comes along and says, I'm not part of that political class, and he clearly isn't, whatever you might think about him, you think, I'm going to vote for him to tell the other lot what I think about them. And I sort of wonder whether that isn't at root of everything you've been saying. The inequality, you said it, Pete. Monica, you also said a gulf between different types. Isn't that it? Isn't that really what's going on here? Maybe just a quick comment on that gulf. Starting again with you, Marianne, and then we'll take a couple of questions and talk about what Oxford can do about it. But Marianne, why don't you answer that?
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting question about how we value people's brains versus their skills or their empathy. In fact, David Goodhart's written a book which has just come out very recently called Head, Hearts and Hands. It might be the other way around, but that, you know, we've really noticed in this pandemic how much we valued people's empathy and courage, you know, all those people wearing PPE, but we don't value it in a monetary way. Now, of course, you could say this is capitalism that's at fault rather than democracy, but of course the two have rather gone together for the past 100 years or so. But I do think we need to start thinking about, is there any way in which we can rig the market in order to give more monetary value to the professions or the occupations that we actually value in our hearts?
Monica?
Well, I think for me, it comes back to this question of what is democracy and what is it for? So is democracy just a matter of procedure? Is it just about process? Does the ends matter? Do the ends matter, or is it just a matter of going to the ballot box once every 4 or 5 years? I mean, is it social democracy? Is it economic democracy? What's its purpose? I mean, is the idea that we have democracy because it's a civilizing way of expressing the idea that each of us has equal worth, or is politics about something more than that or different to that, which is providing a stable economic framework and generating efficiency and not mistreating people? And and if it's about both of those things, how do we marry up both of those things? So to just talk about and assume that liberal democracy is the bee's knees, if only people would just, you know, go along with us because we must know what we're talking about. We need to start from scratch. We need to examine what it is that we are advocating and why we're advocating it.
Pete, come on, a question, because that question was primarily aimed at the United States.
Well, first of all, I think that's exactly right. But procedurally, it can't just be procedural because, of course, as a conservative student will inevitably remind me in my Twitter feed if I ever say something about democracy, we are not and never sought out to be a direct democracy in the Athenian sense. So clearly, when we say democracy, we're not only talking about a system, we're talking about a set of values. And I believe that set of values is valid and more needed than ever. And yet more in danger. I think the question is spot on, and there's a forthcoming book by Michael Sandel on this topic, as well as Daniel Markovitz, The Meritocracy Trap. And it's very important to understand what they're talking about is not just the corruption in which some people of less skill somehow come out ahead, but even when meritocracy works on its own terms, right? There's something very morally unattractive about the gulf that's been created between the most educated and the least. I think this is absolutely an issue. And you know, my first encounter with PPE meaning something different was when I was issued PPE, personal protective equipment, while packing my bags for Afghanistan. And that was an experience in which I came to really understand more than at any other time in my life among my peers, the distinction between education and intelligence, and the distinction between intelligence and character. And that is something that I think is not really celebrated in our system right now. But all of this, I think, has only reached the system-shaking proportions that it today has because it's happening against the backdrop of extreme inequality, and in particular, inequality of income. If it weren't for that, I think some of these other gradations would not be as intolerable. And you can tell just how warping that effect is by considering in US politics the rhetorical attitude toward the establishment. You never want to be anywhere near the establishment, no matter who you are. I saw one president who had been in Congress for, I think, 26 years, sat on the board of one of the world's biggest investment banks, and then was a governor, saying, "I've always fought the establishment. I'm not." The current president of the United States, of course, multimillionaire the day he was born, photographed with every major US political figure of either party over a period of decades, was able to present himself as a tribune of the anti-establishment forces. And again, that just shows you how warped things can become when these inequalities reach the level that they do, and just put a level of I think frustration that transcends some of our normal categories into the mix.
Can I make a very quick point, Evan?
Go on.
Well, it's just, we talk a lot about class privilege, about white privilege, about male privilege. We never talk about intellectual privilege. And actually, it's just absolute chance if you're born with a high IQ, just as it's completely random if you happen to be born white or male or upper class. And yet somehow being bright and therefore doing well educationally, we sort of portray as being deserving of greater merit, and well, merit after all, you know, and a higher income and all that sort of thing. But it's, in a sense, it's just like saying we'll pay you more because you're white or because you're male or because you're rich, you're upper class.
Yeah, I mean, Warren Buffett puts it very well, saying the skill of allocating capital, which he has, does happen to be very generously rewarded at the moment if you can do it well, whereas at a time when we were being chased by lions, it wouldn't have served him very well, and he probably wouldn't have been rewarded that well. And we have to question, you know, whether the moral basis of the reward. It turns out that quite one or two other questions on that, Rake, problems have revealed the metropolitan liberal left elite is out of touch with grassroots voters' lives and concerns. And we could talk a lot more about that. Monica, you've raised the question about what is democracy. I'm going to ask you
to answer it though. You just raise it as a question.
I'm going to tie it with a question that we've had in from Alex Pryor-Wansford, which gets to the Pete point about direct democracy and whether that's a desirable thing, and whether actually referenda would, more of them, would provide a purer form of democracy. Would that erode the basis of liberal democracy, in which you have a kind of thinking elite who are meant to go off and come up with the right answer, and lead to more populism, or not? Because for a lot of people, democracy is about voting rather than about protection of minority rights, for example. One each then on referenda and what is the essential ingredient of democracy. Monica, I think as you raised it, you have first stab.
Oh, sorry, I've lost the thread. What was the first part of the question?
Well, firstly, do you support more referenda as a kind of a way of advancing democracy? But I'm also asking you to reflect on what democracy is, which you raised.
Yeah, so referenda, you know, it's very attractive to think we should be voting on everything all the time, because that's, you know, we vote for pop stars and on reality TV shows, and we rate things and review them and give them stars, and we want to have instant gratification, have our views heard. However, I think that if there are going to be more referenda, then that has to go hand in hand with more education. I don't think that it's a sensible route to take otherwise. I mean, I wouldn't argue, as some have, for a what's it called, epistocracy rather than democracy, but I do think that if you're going to be voting on very complicated issues, then it's necessary to have to give the time and the expenditure and the effort to educating the electorate properly. In terms of what is the heart of democracy, to my mind, it has to encompass both pluralism, social democracy, and economic democracy. I mean, I think that's where it's become so disconnected, as Pete was saying. So those would be my key things.
Can I just, are you not being a bit snobbish in thinking that education is a big part of getting people to vote correctly? Because often the elite, the educated elite, will be divided on an issue, They may not be split down the middle, but they may be divided on an issue. And there will be a kind of an element of heart in that issue. If you said to Canadians, would you like to join the United States? That's not a question you want to leave to the educated people to decide. That would be a question about heart as well, wouldn't it? I just wonder whether whether what you just said about needing to educate people is part of why a lot of people are discontented with
I myself in that. I mean, I didn't really feel that I knew enough about the EU, the benefits of staying or leaving. As you said, I had a heart position, and I read as much as feasibly possible, but I didn't consider myself properly educated. So that is the difficulty. It's not that I would be capable and everyone else is incapable. I include myself in that.
I think we've got to part of that is, I mean, it's always going to be decision making is difficult, and you either leave it to somebody and then they're the agent who makes the decision, which is imperfect because they may not have the same values as you, or you ask people to make it who are less expert. Pete, come on then. So it was referenda, and any reflections on what is democracy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for the agent model. To me, it's less a question of expertise and more specialization. I mean, certainly as a mayor, I felt this: you hire me to deal with these things, so you don't have to. And if I screw up, you can fire me. It's just a function that we expect of people. Certainly in the U.S., I think right now most of our problems stem from the government being not responsive enough to people and not correctly recording our preferences. Certainly the distortions around the presidency, the structure of the Senate do this. But we have seen many examples of what a little too much democracy can do. And the state in the US most identified with referenda, California, has had tremendous difficulties. Among other things, they effectively passed legislation making it impossible to reduce spending and making it impossible to raise taxes at the same time. And so, we need to, I think, pay more attention to who we want to do what, but make sure that they are adequately responsive. I'll also say, obviously from a gay perspective, referenda were not great for us during the early part of this century. Marriage equality, of course, it depended what state you were in, but in the end, it came to my part of the country by way of a court decision, and the reverse would have happened if it were continually left up to popular vote, even though now opinions have changed. I also just want very briefly to mention, I do worry a little bit about the kind of self-flagellation of the liberal urban elites. And I say this as somebody who obviously has a foot in both camps. I've got my fancy Oxford degree, and at the same time, I live in Indiana. Right now I'm in rural Michigan, cornfields, and a part of the country that felt like we were ignored for a long time. And then after the 2016 election, suddenly studied with exotic fascination by journalists and political observers showing up in town saying, take me to your dive bar, show me the American politics. And the thing we should remember is there have been times when the kind of financial elites or the urban progressives have been aligned with workers in terms of rights, wages, and that sort of things. And there have been times when they're not. In the 1920s or even the 1950s in my country, you had two political parties to choose from: the Republicans, who were more authentically progressive and liberal, but also definitely more aligned with the interests of those who were already best off. And then you had the Democratic Party, which was authentically the party of workers and farmers and workers' rights, but also home to most of the racist and nativist elements in US politics. I fear that same pattern with opposite labels has come to show its face in US politics today. I don't want those to be our only two choices.
Yeah, that's a really, really, really important statement. Mary Ann, I'll give you a quick one on referenda and what is democracy. We've got to get to what Oxford needs to do to respond to some of the challenges we've been talking about. But Mary Ann, quick one on that last question we had.
Okay, I'll try and be quick. I think referenda are a very good constraint on governments if they want to do something that is constitutionally irreversible. So, for instance, I don't think you could possibly have Scottish independence without the majority of Scots voting for it. Though, of course, then there's the question, should Scots living elsewhere in the UK also have a vote? All these problems. But having been quite a supporter of referenda I'm starting to be a little more skeptical, mainly just because I think people don't vote for the question on the ballot paper. And I don't think that people were really voting, or at least a lot of people weren't really voting on whether or not to leave the EU. They were voting against the government or against the metropolitan liberal elite or against what they saw as a rigged system. And therefore, however educated, I mean, you know, frankly, if Monica, who's a PPE graduate, can't, you know, finds it difficult to educate herself enough on the issue, then what hope for the whole electorate? As for what is democracy, well, I think democracy has to fundamentally respect the rule of law, respect everybody's equal rights before the law, equal rights to have a vote, equal rights and civil liberties in general. That's the absolute baseline, and everybody's equal freedoms. And these are absolute baselines for democracy. But thereafter, in terms of policies, it's really just for political parties to put a manifesto to the people, and it's for us to throw them out 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah.
And that's the most important factor in democracy, I think.
I have to say, for me, that is the single most important thing, is the ability to kick the government out if you don't like them, because it just forces whoever is running a country to align their values with those of the people they're serving. Right, I noticed that we've got Hood C has made an observation. Beatrice Webb in the 1880s was not willing to hire lecturers in political science at LSE who didn't know anything about municipal drainage. I guess that was a kind of municipal drainage filter to make sure that people had some connection to the real world. Now, look, we've taken a couple of questions there. I want to get you each just to reflect, if you would, on the Oxford challenge, and in a way, I think we as it was written down before this session, it was, how would you each encourage Oxford to continue to confront these questions in surprising and new ways? So that is your that's your next question, folks. Pete, I want to start with you. What would you be encouraging Oxford to do at the moment?
Well, there are very few areas of life in which I would be considered conservative, but this might largely be one of them, in that I felt so well served by a program precisely because it was attentive to broad patterns that in their fundamental dimensions were very much the same across decades or centuries, that pulled me out of the day-to-day life that I was in the US and allowed some critical distance. And so I think in many regards, at least in terms of the PPE program, there's something healthy about its enduring character. Having said that, and I'll tie this actually to the last comment, I'm obviously, nothing is closer to my heart than something like municipal drainage as a mayor. I believe that the sewer stands alongside the city and the university as the 3 greatest inventions of humankind. And you know, what I found myself doing as a PPE is suddenly in charge of things like wastewater when I became mayor, was fusing those 2 questions together, asking myself, okay, why do we have philosophically, why do cities exist? Why does wastewater exist? And then going down to the waterworks and telling the guys, look, part of why your job matters so much is that it is connected to the meaning of life, in that people can only lead meaningful lives if they don't have to wonder whether they're going to be able to get a glass of clean, safe drinking water. And it was largely kind of a theoretical, motivational commentary that I gave, only to see a couple of years later, in the case of Flint, Michigan in the US, where families were poisoned by lead, just what it means when people don't have access to that ability to assume away certain functions. And I raise all of that just by way of one suggestion, which is my own city of South Bend, Indiana, which is the home of the University of Notre Dame, has a lot in common with Oxford. We are an automaking city, largely a working class and comparatively low income community with a magnificent and wealthy university in our midst. And I would often see students go to places like Uganda or Cambodia to broaden their horizons and be involved in service and understand other people's struggles. And that was great. But often as a mayor who started partnering with the university to do more hands-on work in our own backyard, I could show them experiences just as compelling and for them just as novel, 1 or 2 miles away from where they were studying, and they'd never have known it. And so thinking back on how little I saw of the community of Oxford, substantively, I mean, actually connecting the substance of what you're studying to the concerns of the community you're in, not in a condescending way, not in a let me descend from the ivory tower and instruct you provincials on what to do kind of way, but in one that actually forms authentic partnerships that are as broadening and beneficial to the students and to the university community as they are to the physical community that surrounds it. I think there's a lot that could be done there. and would love to see Oxford develop in that direction.
Okay, Oxford municipal drainage courses added to the PPE roster will be one suggestion. Monica, what's your advice?
I sort of got the opposite view to Pete, which is that I think that the PPE course should be radically shaken up and revised, the same kind of level of reformulation as the move from classics to PPE. I think it's, I really would question, with the caveat that I haven't actually studied the current PPE syllabus, but if it's anything like it was 30 years ago when I was studying, I would argue that it's way out of date for the idea that it's going to produce civil servants and politicians of the future. I think, you know, we'd have to introduce a whole raft of new things, such as, so that it becomes truly polymath again. I think it was seen as a polymath degree to put all those things together back then. I think now if you were to reinvent it, you would put courses on systems thinking, you would do courses on AI, on data management, which is so beloved by Dominic Cummings. You'd broaden and contemporize it in huge ways. I mean, just take one little example. When I think about the National Archive of government documents, wherever it's held, is it Kew? I mean, that's a sort of the place of record for government activity. But what about politics as conducted by tweet? What about social media in general? What about, you know, breaking the internet and looking at Dominic Cummings's blogs versus reading the textbooks? And I think, you know, politics is conducted in a different way now than it was. Also, I'd be looking more broadly globally. My course was certainly, there were some options to do politics or economic development of India or so on, but basically it was very Western centric, and I think that is a mistake looking forward. You know, why not introduce a course on, maybe this has happened already, but you know, how Singapore, which is a very efficient government, whatever we think about its sort of authoritarian tones, it's a very efficient government. How does it work? Why do they pay their civil servants so much money compared to how we pay our civil servants here? So I would just throw it all out and start again.
Okay, more radical idea. Mary Ann, what about you?
Well, I'm interested in what Oxford can do to confront this dangerous loss of faith in democracy, since we're really here to talk about democracy. And I've got three ideas. I mean, first of all, I think it's really important to teach students just how easily strong leaders can betray their citizens, how they almost always become corrupt and they clamp down on opposition and the media, and they run their countries in their own interests and in the interests of their own cabals rather than those of their people. And crucially, as we said earlier, students need to understand just how difficult it is then to get rid of them. And I think a lot of young people don't appreciate that really important part of democracy. But more innovatively, I think perhaps Oxford could examine why it is that trust in government is so much higher in authoritarian regimes such as China and Rwanda. So, you know, what are they doing right that our democracies are doing wrong? And are there things that we can learn from them if we want to restore trust in our own democratic governments? I don't know if Oxford's doing that, but I think it'd be really interesting if it did. And finally, of course, we have to teach students that the best way to get their concerns addressed by democratic governments is to vote and vote and vote again. You know, why have successive governments favoured the interests of the middle-aged and the old over those of the young? Because the old actually turn out at the ballot box. And in an authoritarian regime, your voice won't be heard at all. In a democracy, it will, but only if you use it. So it's crazy to despair of democracy if you're not even taking part in it.
Okay, we're coming up to an hour. We can extend a little bit. I think my suggestion would be something to do, and maybe this is picking up from Pete, would be something around getting the students out to places they wouldn't otherwise go, and particularly away from their comfort zones in terms of their backgrounds. it's astonishing that of my 15 closest friends of Oxford, every single one of them is living in London, apart from one who is living in Berlin. And it's sort of, okay, that is quite interesting, isn't it? That somehow we didn't get out there. I had one friend who went off and worked in a newspaper group in Hull when he left university, but very quickly came back to London, and that group doesn't have much presence in Hull now anyway. So I think if I was revamping the course, I would probably try, if it was possible, to get some kind of teach first sort of, in a whole range of professions. Basically, the students had to go away for 6 months or 2 terms or even a year, and do something away from their home and away from Oxford, and probably away from London, which is going to be where they'll end up living anyway. So something that would get people out would be my suggestion. But where I want to finish with you all, I want to sort of throw a challenge there, is, and we've had a question about identity politics, by the way. What role does it play in democracy? And we haven't discussed culture war, identity politics, all huge issues at the moment. But I want to just discuss the diversity, because we've got a panel that looks here diverse in ways which would be traditionally measured, but incredibly cognitively not diverse, because we're all PPEists, and we've come out of this thing, and I don't know, my values are not public because I work for the BBC, but statistically, you could probably plot down what I think about 10 issues fairly accurately. I guess should we be worried about that? Is that a sign of failure, that there's relatively little diversity, of cognitive diversity on a panel like this? Or is that a sign of that basically people who are well educated are going to take a number of views because those are the right views to take, and other people should get with the program? I don't know. Mary Ann, you first.
Yeah, I get the feeling there's actually even less cognitive diversity in universities now than there was in my day. I mean, I was there just at the beginning of Thatcherism, and there was actually huge diversity of political views. Like Monica, I was at Wadham. We were all very progressive and left wing. But William Hague was in my year, and he was wearing tweed suits and talking at the Tory party conference. And now, I mean, academia in general, not just the student cohort, but dons as well, seem to have become much more centre-left and left than they were even in my day. And it's sort of almost anathema, I think, in universities these days to be a supporter of Brexit, for instance. And that worries me a lot.
Monica, do you get worried about that?
Yeah, I sort of thought you were asking about not different viewpoints, but is that what you were asking about?
Well, actually, I left it a little bit open by using the phrase cognitive diversity, because it could mean different ways of looking at things, even though you might come to the same view at the end of it. But just interpret it however you want.
Okay, well, I mean, I think I find the idea of cognitive diversity in terms of different intellectual abilities or backgrounds, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, this particular panel is PPE, so there's some commonality there for a reason. But in terms of other panels and discussions and Radio 4 and public anything in public forums, yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to raise, and a really valid point to raise. I mean, I don't see in terms of expertise, that's one thing. In terms of desire and goals and values, that's an altogether different thing. And I think we need to have a range of feelings and voices from every different ability level. Absolutely. I think that's a really good point that you've raised.
Okay, Pete, you're going to get the last word on that one, and anything else you want to talk about before we draw this to a close.
Well, I guess I think about it in terms of our sort of circles of belonging or identity, whether it's in terms of our capabilities or our racial or ethnic backgrounds, or religious or just physical communities of belonging where we are. The more those circles can be overlapping, the better. I may not belong to your religious community, but you and I belong to the same football team, and on the weekends we play and we get to know each other, and that builds trust as well as belonging. Those circles that we would hope would largely be overlapping, I think, have increasingly become concentric for many reasons. And so it is easier to pick, just by knowing a few key data points about somebody, to be able to figure out the rest of them. And of course, we have black box algorithms serving up content on social media that do precisely that. So perversely, even as we have more access to one another than ever, we're being sorted more tightly than ever. We need to find ways to break that up. And I can think of few better places for that breaking up to go on than the university and environment. And I do think that's going to be one of the most important things universities have to offer across the 21st century. So maybe that's a note of hope. I still think that look, the 21st century has not gotten off to a fantastic start, nor has this year or decade. I still think the 2020s could actually be viewed as a deciding decade in a very positive direction, depending on some of the choices that a lot of our countries face in the next few months. That'll be my note of optimism to end on. And
well, just before we let you go, Pete, I think it would be dereliction of journalistic duty not to just ask you for some reflection on the American election and how it's going for Trump and how it's going for Biden. From here, it looks very much like Trump is struggling, really, and Biden's got it. But it will be, it feels like so much hinges on that election. Even here, if Trump is humiliated, will Trumpy elements of politics here be will they recede, or will they not? And it just feels like it's such a pivotal event in which all the issues that we're talking about are going to be litigated in the United States in what might be a flawed process. We just have to hear some reflection on that from you.
Sure, I'll give you the compact. Is Trumpism will not go away, even if Trump does. And I imagine that's the same for its analogs. But the question that's about to be settled is whether this is its high watermark. I think that if the election were held today, the answer would be yes. And indeed, there could be, based on the numbers I'm seeing in relatively red state, conservative states that seem to be tipping Democratic, very encouraging. What matters most, actually, is the Senate and the congressional side, because there are so many Republicans who despise or know better, let's say that, who have decided to ride this tiger because they think it's politically necessary. If they suffer a loss of power as a consequence of aligning themselves with this sort of leadership that is, frankly, as offensive to conservative principles as it is to liberal ones, that is what it would take to send out shockwaves powerful enough to reunite Republicans with their conscience, which is what American democracy needs, even as I remain squarely committed to the beliefs of my own party. If the election were held today, I think that would probably happen. There is a real tailwind for my party in terms of people seeing the situation around us. But first of all, this is a game of inches. Secondly, because we're not a proper democracy in many regards, this has much more to do with the mechanics of the Electoral College than what any national poll can tell you. And third, there is a very real headwind in terms of the mechanics of the elections themselves. So I would be prepared for anything. This could be a very good outcome, or it could be pretty bleak. And the thing for which we are least prepared is the fact that Election Day probably won't be resolved in one day at all.
Oh, goodness. Well, there's a lot going to happen over the next few months. That is certainly all going to be incredibly interesting, as is the pandemic as well, and the way that plays out. I think PPE has another 100 years in it. I think it's got through its first. I think there will be something, hopefully not over Zoom, in 100 years' time, where PPE will be celebrated. There will be a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of angst among the class who are doing it about whether they're serving the public well, and quite right too, because we should always be questioning. Questioning we've been doing very well. So let me just thank all of you who've been watching, have been watching as we've recorded it, and those of you watching it afterwards. Thank you to those putting questions in. I'm sorry I couldn't even get to a fraction of them. So much to talk about. But above all, thanks to Ann Sieghart, Monica Ali, and Pete Buttigieg. Really great discussion. Thanks all very much indeed. Very good afternoon.